Hey, deserving listeners, today we're going to talk about perfectionism. Perfectionism is a really difficult thing for people. It can cause all sorts of problems for people in their lives. Things like lack of motivation, low self-esteem, anxiety, and worrying about things being perfect. It can even lead to eating disorders, difficulties in school with being able to actually turn things in for fear of it not being perfect. It can lead to depression, other mood disorders. It can lead to impostor syndrome, feeling like you're just an imposter, faking like you're good at something. And with all that stress, you can become burnt out with something because you're trying all the time to be perfect, and it will burn you out. And you just say, I can't do this anymore. And it can even lead to suicide. Perfectionism has been linked with actually dying. So perfectionism can, in essence, kill people. It's really rough. It's a really rough experience for the most part. And of course, the internet is full of bad information about perfectionism. The internet loves to distort our psychological concepts. When it comes to perfectionism, the internet seems to think that it's just, liking things to be in order or preferring to be organized or something. And certainly that can be an element of perfectionism. But as I've, mentioned, perfectionism can be much more difficult than just a preference for things being in order. And of course, if you're a famous person or a famous performer and you're particular about your performances being good, then the internet will label you as a perfectionist. People like Madonna or something. It's like she cares about her shows and therefore she's a perfectionist. Barbra Streisand, this kind of thing. And all that talk on the internet just really, I think, demeans the experience of actual humans. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk about perfectionism and kind of go through all the different aspects of it and the different levels, and there's beneficial forms of perfectionism and also destructive. By the way, this episode is a patron only episode, but I have a few things to say before we get to the patron zone. I want to talk about myself in this episode. So, I sometimes struggle with perfectionism myself. For example, when it comes to this podcast, there are times when I'm doing a deep dive, like with this episode, and I will be, researching and talking and thinking and reading and writing and, just that whole process. And it, takes a long time. And there's a lot of twists and turns in the researching of things. Each one of these topics I will kind of know a little bit about, but in order to do a really good episode, or the sort of episode that I think I'm capable of, or the sort of episode that I think the listeners deserve, I really set my mind on producing something that I think is like, perhaps the best episode that's ever been made in the podcasting world on a particular topic. And I know that's super grandiose, but there's just not a lot of podcasters who have the luxury, like I do, to dedicate all the time necessary to do something as comprehensive, I should say. Maybe not the best episode on perfectionism, but like the most comprehensive. I'm a very comprehensive perfectionist. I need to read every single research article, every book, everything online. I need to read everything that's ever been produced about a particular topic before I make an episode about it. And when it comes to that process, like I said, there's a lot of twists and turns in that, and I need to keep my motivation up, because at any time I could just be like, okay, I'm not going to do this. I'll just do something easier, or even I'll just stop doing the podcast altogether. There's no one employs me to do this. I do this on my own. And at any time I could just pull the plug, or at the very least I could slow down and just be like, let's put less effort into this. It's sort of hard to do all this stuff. And so to spend, 8, 12 hours a day just reading and researching and writing, you need to keep your motivation up. And one of the things that keeps my motivation up is this this drive to produce something that is, like I said, comprehensive, that really fully encapsulates a particular topic. And there are times in the winding road getting there that I will become quite confused. There will be times when I wonder, what am I doing? Or do I really understand this concept? Or how much work is this going to actually take? Because sometimes these episodes will take months of my time to research. And, there are times when you have a bad mood moment. And in those moments of bad mood and, demoralization, I have this vision in my head, a sort of unspoken vision of this episode just being really bad. I have this image of like, oh, this episode is going to be not perfect. It is going to be mediocre. People are going to listen to this episode and think, oh, Kirk, nice try, but you really missed the mark here. And, I get feedback like that sometimes, so it's not like it's inconceivable. And in those moments, because of my perfectionism, it will feel very bad to me. It will, my mood will plummet, my motivation will plummet, and I'll be staring at the computer screen. I'll just be like, what am I doing with my life? I shouldn't be doing this. I'm trying to do something that I will fail at. I'm going to fail. This is going to be awful. And I will just stop. I can't go on. I have that burnout feeling. I have that giving up feeling of just like, why am I trying to make some, it's sort of like a similar experience that I have with this is when it comes to cooking. I'm not very good at cooking. And so there are times when every once in a while where I'll be tasked with cooking something, and I'll be in the middle of cooking something and I'll just be like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't know what temperature things should be. I don't know what a pinch of salt exactly means. I don't know when meat is actually cooked all the way through. So what am I doing here? I shouldn't be here. And that's that feeling when I run into, that down that valley of motivation and with developing a podcast episode. And that's perfectionism, it's sort of the yin and yang of perfectionism, which is that perfectionism can be beneficial for people and for me, in that when I am in the zone and things are going well, I am highly motivated to produce what I believe to be the closest thing to perfect I can make, the most comprehensive, the most well-instructive episode that's ever been made on a topic. Now, of course, that's ridiculous because I haven't consumed every single thing that's ever been made on a topic. But sometimes I literally believe that. It's just like, podcasting is fairly new. Of course, in 50 years, if there are still podcasts, there will be so many other psychological podcasts that will surpass me, of course. But right now, it's still kind of in the Wild West. Think of like early radio days in the 30s or something. It's still possible now to produce like the quintessential episode on a particular topic. And so anyway, that motivates me. I'm like, oh man, I can do this. Look at, all this stuff that I have, and I have all this stuff available to me, and I'm privileged with my time, and the patrons are paying money, and they, I can take money away from my regular job and really dedicate to this particular topic. What a great thing. I'm gonna produce this monument of an episode to a particular topic. Again, it's super grandiose, but it that's what motivates me. It gives me a lot of pleasure to be able to produce that kind of stuff. It feels good. And so that's the perfectionism that helps me, the striving for a perfect product. And of course, I always know it's never perfect. I mean, I can already just think in the however long I've been talking to you so far, 10 minutes or so, that I've already screwed up several things. I've stuttered, I've misspoke, I've regretted certain word choices. So it's not like it's perfect, but I hope you get my meaning. It's like a high motivation to make something that is of high quality, not only to me, but to other people as well. So so that's the good side of perfectionism. But then when I run into self-doubt and those voices start to come into your head, just like, this is going to be crappy. Everyone's going to see how stupid this is. You'll never be able to make the most perfect episode. It's not possible. You don't know how to do this. What are you doing? And then the motivation just completely drops out from underneath me, and I go falling, and I'm just like, what am I doing here? And I walk away. Now, I've been doing this podcast for over 10 years, and so I've had these moments so many times that I know immediately what's happening. And that is that, I'm just running into the bad side of perfectionism, and I just need to take a break. And if I take a break, however long it takes, sometimes it just means like a half an hour or something, but sometimes it's like a day or two or even a week. And in that time, it's sort of like my brain resets or something, and I forget what was the premise behind my demoralization, and I come back to it. Or fresh eyes looking at something, or sometimes it's just saying to myself later, a couple days later, just saying like, well, look, it's not going to be the best episode. There's probably dozens of other podcast episodes by other people that are better than this. But you know what? I really want to do it anyway, and I'm going to do it even though this episode's going to be mediocre. So in that way, I, through my therapy and through my own contemplation and self-care, have learned to stay on the beneficial side of perfectionism, and to sort of stave off the negative side of perfectionism. So that's perfectionism, and I'm going to get into the pros and cons of perfectionism more later. So I want to tell a story about a client who suffered from perfectionism as a way of bringing this into the clinical world. So, and as always, whenever I talk about clients, I always mask their identity to protect their confidentiality. This is a teenage Asian girl, and her presenting problem was that she was breaking rules at home. She was talking back to her parents. She was, her grades weren't doing so great. She was skipping school. She was hanging out with different sort of crowd, caught shoplifting. She would state that she suffered from anxiety. And her parents forced her into therapy, and she wasn't very enthusiastic about therapy at first. So it took me a while to build a relationship with her. With some teenagers like this and children, it can take a long time. You really have to spend, even if they're talkative and quite polite in therapy, it can take a long time for anyone, frankly, to develop a relationship, particularly for people who are being forced into therapy. And at first I thought, this therapy situation, she doesn't really seem to want anything. We're working on things kind of, but not really. But then she had a crisis. She had a breakup with a boyfriend. And she also, during that time, was experiencing a lot of bullying at school. And this resulted in her resorting to cutting, non-suicidal self-injury. And she was caught by her father cutting in the bathroom. And her father, her family was very alarmed. And she was very alarmed too. She, in that moment kind of had a wake-up call of just like, man, I probably should be talking with my therapist more openly about my life. And so she opened up, and she talked about how she was suffering deeply, really, and that she had been cutting to cope with deep insecurities and deep feelings of loneliness. Now, she had some borderline traits, but she wasn't high on the spectrum, as evidenced by her ability to trust me fairly quickly after the crisis. And she told me more about her life, and so I'm thinking, okay, we're getting somewhere in therapy. She's opening up. I'm glad that she's doing that. And I eventually discovered that she has been spending a lot of time on social media, particularly Instagram. And she told me that she was basically semi-famous in the teen Instagram world as someone who knew a lot about hair and makeup and fashion and this kind of stuff. And even though she had attained some fame, she was constantly thinking about how she could be more famous. In her mind, she wanted to have the most famous, or I don't know the term, the most liked, the most shared, the most followed Instagram feed of all time when it came to fashion and makeup and hair and that kind of stuff. Like other super famous Instagram people like the Kardashians or something, or Jenners. And it was all that she thought about. I mean, certainly there's a lot of people who think about that, but she thought about it a lot. And there were times when she felt very good about herself after getting some sort of accolade online, like, I don't know, one of the Kardashians or Jenners following her on Instagram or something. But really more often she was feeling deeply inferior and she was deeply suffering. She hated the way she looked. She thought she was too fat. She thought she was ugly. She thought her nose looked too Asian. And all of this negativity towards herself would, sort of cause her to ruminate on what she was doing on Instagram. And she would have moments like me, it was sort of more exaggerated, where she'd be like in the zone and she'd be, making Instagram posts and doing little videos and stuff. And everything was going well for her because she was getting a lot of accolades. And then there are other moments where she, thought, I'm imperfect, I'm ugly, what am I doing here? Not enough people follow me. And she would have, her motivation would just plummet. And she would think about completely closing your Instagram account altogether, which for some of us is not a big deal, but for her, that was like, a really big move. And so this was something that was really consuming to her. And again, similar to me, she would have positive moments and negative moments, but dissimilar to me, she experienced 99% of the time, she was experiencing some sort of negative suffering as a result of this perfectionistic loop that she was in. And so the therapy with her involved helping her to see this process for what it was. And the temptation that I had at first was just to tell her, like, just close your Instagram account. This is stupid. Because I don't use Instagram. I every once in a while, someone will motivate me to do Instagram. And I had a marketing person actually tell me recently, like, oh, you got to be on Instagram. And I'm like, oh, okay, fine. And I sort of dabbled in it for like 5 seconds. And I was like, ugh, Instagram, it's such a weird interface. Like you can't use your computer, you have to use your phone. And it's just like, why? Anyway. But anyway, so from my perspective, I'm just like, just close your Instagram account. Like, if it's causing you so much problems, just move on. But that is a simplistic way of looking at things. It's sort of like when we look at people who are complaining about their spouses or something, they're having a lot of really bad experiences and fighting with their spouse. And you're just like, well, just divorce your husband, move on in life. And, and there are a lot of therapists that engage in that sort of simplistic life changing decisions as a way of solving your problems. And that wouldn't solve her problem, right? She's a perfectionistic person. And so if it wasn't Instagram, it would just be something else. And also, there's a lot of benefits to her using Instagram. Like for me, with the podcast, I suffer sometimes with my perfectionism when it comes to the podcast. But during those suffering times, if someone said like, well, just stop the podcast, I'd be like, geez, you really just don't understand the bigger picture here. So I quickly realized that that's a simplistic way of looking at it. I'm not going to tell her to stop doing Instagram. And so the trick was, how do we help her with her Instagram sort of fame or use or enjoyment, and not have her suffer as a result, right? And so what it involved was helping her to understand where her thoughts are coming from, be aware of where her emotions are coming from, being aware of the sort of cognitions that she has about failure and about making mistakes. And also another part of it, eventually, and I'll get more into the treatment later, involved helping her to actually just expose herself to making mistakes. So one of the things that we did was I just had her post things on Instagram that were terrible, that like emphasized her nose, like were bad angles of her nose or bad angles of her face, or were, when her hair looked bad or something, and she took to it pretty quickly. She's like, oh, okay. And so, as she did that, she's like, oh, I get it. Like my idea of failure is actually not accurate. My idea of making a mistake is actually not accurate. I thought that failure was the worst. I thought that showing my nose was a mistake, but in reality, it's not. Like it's okay, it's fine. And sure, some of the things that I post aren't going to get as much love and attention as other things, but who cares? What's the focus of my life? And this is where existential therapy comes in, which is just like, what is the purpose of my life? Is the purpose of my life to suffer and toil over Instagram, or is it something else? And once people actually establish what that something else is, then it puts things into perspective. Okay, so let's go into the definition. Again, we're going to go to the patron zone soon, but I just want to go over the definition and prevalence here for a second. So what's the definition of perfectionism? So there are a lot of definitions of perfectionism in the literature, and it's not a DSM diagnosis. So therefore, it doesn't have a lot of precise definitions in the clinical literature. So, but it is a fairly well-researched construct and does have a lot of definitions out there, but it's unclear exactly where the line is between with someone that has perfectionism and someone that doesn't, if that makes any sense. But really, in my book, all things psychology related are like that, or most things, I should say. Like narcissism, it's like, where's the line between you having narcissism and not? It's debatable. Anyway, perfectionism, the definition is a personality disposition. So sometimes the literature will talk about it as a personality disposition or a temperament or a trait or just a style of living. So just keep that in mind. But anyway, perfectionism is characterized by three different things. One is exceedingly high standards of your own performance. So with the client, she needed her Instagram to be perfect, and she needed her face and body and nose and hair to be perfect. So she had exceedingly high standards of her performance on Instagram. Perfectionism is also characterized by, number two, concerns about making mistakes. So this is where someone ruminates and worries about making mistakes. The client was very worried about losing her audience on Instagram, and she really ruminated and remembered all the different times that she had made a mistake on Instagram. Number three, lastly, perfectionism is characterized by concerns about the social consequences of not being perfect. So with this client, she was very worried about being rejected by people on the internet, being seen as a hack or being thirsty on Instagram or something. So as some of you might already detect, there's a lot of overlap between perfectionism and other concepts that I've talked about, namely narcissistic personality disorder, avoidant attachment, this kind of thing. And there's some overlap, but not tremendous. It's not like, I would say that perfectionism is probably 20% overlapped with narcissism. So there are plenty of perfectionistic people that I would not put on the narcissistic spectrum. So again, as I was talking about earlier, the internet has a lot of really funny things to say about perfectionism. Top 10 signs that you're a perfectionist, and then it'll just be like these really minor issues. Lots of celebrities are labeled as perfectionists. Daniel Craig, Eminem, Gwyneth Paltrow, Beyonce, Adele, Steve Jobs, as I said, Madonna, Kim Kardashian. Kim Kardashian seems to be labeled with everything. Everyone on the internet has diagnosed her with everything. I imagine Donald Trump and Hillary and Obama have a similar fate. Basically, all these people in the articles that I read were people like Eminem he's a perfectionist. Again, it's not a DSM diagnosis, so it's fine to throw that word around for the most part. In the I'm not as upset about people throwing around the word perfectionism as I am about people throwing around narcissistic personality or antisocial or psychopathy or sociopath or something. But anyway, that people seem to not be in line with the literature in that they basically just look for any performer who really cares about their product and labels them as a perfectionist. Eminem and Beyonce, these performers are, they're very interested in making sure that their art is good, and because that's what people want. That people want a good, product, and they really care about their art. And so, just because someone really cares about their art doesn't necessarily mean they're perfectionist. It could very well mean that they are, but it could also just mean that they're just a really good artist and they really care about their art, and that doesn't mean you're a perfectionist. Perfectionism, again, you have to have excessively high standards for yourself. Beyonce really caring about her next album and, spending a year or two on that album and putting in, good work, but not breaking her back over it. I wouldn't call that excessively high standards. I would just call that like, well, that's kind of like her job, isn't it? And she cares about her art. So you really need to have like excessively high standards where most people would be like, oh, come on, like you're not going to achieve that. That's not going to happen. Some of you might already be saying that about me. It's like, come on, Kirk, like there's a lot of podcasts out there. The chance that you're going to produce the definitive episode on perfectionism, that's pretty excessive, don't you think? And so I would agree with that. You also need to have like excessive concerns about making mistakes. Again, if you're Eminem and you're making your next album or something, and you don't want to make mistakes, but you just have the normal range of worry about making mistakes and the normal range of doing things to account for mistakes, then you're not a perfectionist. No one wants to make a mistake, right? So you really have to have excessive concern about making a mistake. And also you need to have excessive concern about the social consequences of not being perfect, to the point where you really suffer, For example, Stanley Kubrick is a good example of this. Now, maybe Eminem and Beyonce and all the others, maybe they do suffer from it. But I in the articles that were written about them, they didn't give any evidence like this. But with Stanley Kubrick, you actually do see this perfectionism construct at play. If you're not familiar with Stanley Kubrick, Google him. He has directed some of my favorite movies, most namely A Clockwork Orange, 2001 Space Odyssey, Barry Lyndon, other movies like that. So he was, in The Shining, for example, he was famous for being a perfectionist and suffering from his perfectionism. He wasn't just a director who, really cared about his movies. He cared too much, and people around him would say, "Stanley, you care too much. You're ruining your life because you care too much." Like, if you just ratcheted it down a little bit, people would still love your movies. In fact, they might like them more, and you wouldn't be suffering so much. And he was famous for shooting many, many takes just to get things right. For example, in the Shining, he broke apparently a world record by shooting the same scene 148 times. And I think it's just this little scene between the old man who has the psychic powers and the kid. There's just a conversation they're having like in the kitchen or something. And when I watch this scene, I'm like, that's the scene that took 148 takes, because it seems so silly that you would need to do that many times. But Stanley Kubrick was so concerned and so consumed with the anxiety about making a mistake and not having the shots be perfect that he was like, no, we're going to do it again. Just imagine that, being an actor or being anyone on that set 148 times. That probably took several days, I'm guessing. I don't know. And you're just like, again? We're going to do this again? And haven't we got it yet? Like, so, there was that. And he reportedly, again, suffered a lot and had to take several years off from making films because he was paralyzed with the fear of making a mistake. Stanley Kubrick is, I think, semi-famous for the fact that there's blocks and chunks of time where he wasn't making any movies, when people were just like, so hungry for another movie from him. Today, like Damien Chazelle and Denis Villeneuve, and another Villeneuve, the other directors, they make a movie every couple years. Well, Stanley Kubrick in his time was like mega famous. He was one of the big ones, Francis Ford Coppola, this kind of thing. And to not have anything come out was very strange. And that was because he was, in essence, metaphorically in a fetal position, terrified by fear of making a mistake. And so he's a good example of an actual famous person who suffered from perfectionism. Again, just because you're Madonna and you really care about your performances doesn't mean you're a perfectionist in terms of the clinical literature. Apparently, Winston Churchill talked about perfectionism. He said, "The maxim, nothing but perfection, may be spelled paralysis." So I don't know if this is just the internet lying to me that Winston Churchill said this, but anyway, Winston Churchill recognized that, look, if you strive for perfection, then you're going to be paralyzed because it's, too hard to achieve perfectionism, and the anxiety that is accompanies the striving for perfectionism will cause you to not do anything. All right, so what's the prevalence of perfectionism? Well, there's not much research, but of the research available, it seems like it might be fairly prevalent. For example, one study of grade school girls found that 25% of them showed signs of perfectionism. And anecdotally, I would say that figure is probably about right. I would say about 25% of people have some form of perfectionism, whether or not it's beneficial or destructive, I would say that they're probably somewhere on that spectrum. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less, not quite sure. But when I think about all the people around me and the clients I've worked with, I would say that as far as the definition of perfectionism that I work with and that a lot of other researchers work with, I would say that a good portion of people actually do suffer from perfectionism. And most typically what I find is that of the perfectionists that I know clinically and personally, most of them are actually in the paralysis phase where they are not doing anything because they're terrified of making a mistake. There are a lot of closet perfectionists out there that I know of who are they really want to make something. They want to be a painter. They want to be a photographer. They want to be a singer. They want to change their jobs. They want to do better at school. They want to have a better yard. They want to have a better house, or whatever the thing is. They're really consumed with those thoughts, but they're so demoralized with low self-esteem or something that they never actually take actions, or they rarely take action along those lines. They would frame it as they're procrastinating or they're being lazy, but really what's happening is they're paralyzed with perfectionistic ideas. That they think, I should work on that thing, and then they get a little bit down the road and they suddenly realize, oh my God, what if I screw up? What if no one likes this? What if this is mediocre? What if this ends up being really bad? And then they have this tremendous amount of worry about that, and then they stop, because like me, when I'm making podcasts, when you're terrified, it's hard to do anything, right? It's hard to do anything, particularly when it comes to artistic, creative expression. It's hard to concentrate on that when your brain is dominated by worry of any kind, let alone worry of perfectionism. So yeah, that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the 4 different perspectives of perfectionism. I want to provide some other stories. I'm going to talk about Umberto for a little bit. I'm going to talk about the history of perfectionism and outcomes. There's a lot of good and bad outcomes of perfectionism. I want to talk about the different measures. In psychology, we have different psychological measures, psychological tests for perfectionism, which illuminate different dimensions of perfectionism, or different types or different aspects. There's a lot of really great research looking at the different aspects of perfectionism. I want to look at the causes. There are a number of different causes I want to get into: temperament, personality, gender socialization, parenting, school environment, sports environment, culture, etc. What causes people, particularly parenting. Parenting is a big cause of perfectionism. I want to talk about some other random things: impostor syndrome, sexual perfectionism. And then I want to go into the treatment and maybe even the self-treatment of perfectionism. Welcome to the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. This episode is just for patrons of the podcast. So if you're not a patron of the podcast yet, if you want to hear this full episode, along with hundreds of other deep dives into various topics, you have to become a patron of the podcast by going to patreon.com. When you become a patron at patreon.com, you will get instructions on how to access all of our patron exclusive episodes. So do that now, and you will probably not regret it, because these episodes are perfect, as I always hope that they will be.